Alright, so now that we've talked a little bit about culture and we've learned a little bit about some of the basics, we're going to learn a little bit more about the study of culture and also now about researcher bias when studying culture. One of the interesting things about culture is that it doesn't feel like it's learned. It feels like it's just simply there. And so when we experience our culture, we don't even think about it as being different from the cultures of other people. But if you don't understand cultural matters in terms of different countries, different states, different cities, even different regions within a city, you can show your ignorance to other groups. And you may inadvertently offend somebody, get yourself hurt, and in some extreme instances, you can end up in jail. All right, so let's look at some examples of how different cultures express the same types of symbols. Now this is called the fig. And what's interesting about the fig is in the United States, this is usually grandpa or grandma when you're a baby telling you they've got your nose. But if you use this gesture in Turkey, Russia, or Indonesia, in certain areas of those countries, it is very offensive. This is the mutza. Now, interestingly, in the United States today, we call this talk to the hand. It's usually accompanied by some kind of neck roll, but this is a very old hand gesture. It dates all the way back to the ancient Byzantine, where prisoners were chained up and paraded through town, and the local people would rub their feces on the prisoners. So the origin of the mutza is very, very old. We have adapted that talk to the hand gesture that we use, but you have to be careful when you're using this gesture in some places around the world because it has a different meaning. Likewise, hook 'em horns or rock on is also called the corna, another old symbol. And making this gesture in some places means that you think a husband's wife is cheating on him. So again, while it's an innocent gesture in most parts of the United States and means something positive, in other countries around the world, it means something negative. Here again, a good luck symbol in the United States, something very positive, something that doesn't mean anything negative or bad, but in Vietnam this can be a very insulting symbol. And here in the United States we use the thumbs up as good job or perhaps hitchhiking, but some regions of Australia use this in a negative way. And finally, Finland. You know, if you've got your hands crossed over your chest here, it might mean that you're cold. But in Finland, it's a very offensive sign when you're having a discussion with somebody to cross your hands to them. It means that you might be offended by something that they're saying, and it also offends the other person when you do it. So you have to be careful about that. Now, all of those symbols that I've shared with you have been shared with me by students that I've had from different countries over the years. You may not have bad experiences when you use those symbols in other countries, but the point here is that we have to really be careful, and we have to make sure that we're making an attempt to at least adapt to cultural changes that might be happening when we visit other countries. So how could you end up in jail? Well, in the Philippines, wiggling your finger to say come over here is a very offensive sign. And again, this was shared with me from a student that I had who came from the Philippines. It may be a regional thing there, or it may be something that is countrywide. But in the Philippines, if you're motioning for somebody to come to you, I would say it's probably a good idea not to use that gesture. Now, likewise, what's interesting about the three fingers raised sign is all of my students in the last couple of years when I've used this sign in the classroom have told me that it comes from the Hunger Games. It does not come from the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games adapted it. It has been known for decades around the world as a sign of opposition to the government. And oftentimes in a very unstable country where there is a resistance group forming against the government or the establishment, this will be a sign that they'll use to identify themselves to each other. When there's a protest, they'll use this sign to show their solidarity against the government. And so it can be a sign that when the government officials or law enforcement agencies see it, can put you in jail so that a coup d'etat or an overthrow is more difficult to mount against the regime. All right, so just some basic definitions here. Now remember, I told you we were concentrating on the West, and in this class specifically, we're going to concentrate on the United States. When we talk about mainstream culture, we can think about that in terms of America as the middle class. All of the things that we think of as normalized, all of the things that we teach and instill in our children, the ways that we interact with each other, all of the language that we use with each other would be considered mainstream culture. As an offset of that, or a subset of that, we have subcultures. Subcultures exist within the mainstream, however, they might have a certain characteristic or attribute that sets them apart at times from the mainstream. As an example, we could talk about a subculture as people who bowl. Not every American bowls. It's not a big deal if you do bowl. You're still a part of the mainstream, but you share some subcultural characteristics. You have some specialized language that you use when you bowl. When you bowl, you're surrounded by other like-minded people who share similar characteristics or attributes. So that's an example of a subculture. Another example, ballroom dancers, the same kind of thing. Another example, college graduates, that is a subculture of the mainstream. So the point here is that a subculture exists within that mainstream culture. It's not seeking to overthrow the mainstream, but it is attempting to live within the mainstream, sharing its own specialized set of attributes on the side, so to speak. Now, countercultures do not exist within the mainstream. They oppose the mainstream, and their real goal is to create a new kind of society with its new set of cultural ideals. And so this would be groups that stand apart from the mainstream and don't share in those mainstream cultural ideals and goals. So if we think about this in terms of the United States, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the hippies were a counterculture. Today in the United States, we could see countercultural groups as those who live independent of the mainstream, such as the Amish counterculture. So a counterculture doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. It could be one or the other. Back in the day, the Hells Angels were considered countercultural. Today, I'm not sure that they would fit that actual definition. I don't know much about them. I'd have to investigate that a bit more. Terrorist groups are countercultural groups. Some militia types of groups are countercultural groups. Multiculturalism is a term that means we support the values of many cultures. And in the United States, we do call ourselves a multicultural society, meaning that our goal or our ideal is to support the values of the many groups who immigrate to the United States. But problematic to that is that it can cause confusion. For example, we want to say that we support people who come from other countries who speak a different language. This becomes very challenging, however, when we have to, for example, teach children in school, or when we want somebody to serve on a jury and they don't have a good enough grasp of the English language. And so multiculturalism, while it is a value that we hold to be important to us, can be problematic to us over time. As an opposition to multiculturalism, we also tend to encourage assimilation. And what this requires is that minority groups or groups who have come here from other countries adapt to the dominant culture of America, meaning that we generally tend to require that you learn to speak English, that you learn to obey traffic signs, that your children behave in a specific way while they are in school. This is not always seen as a positive action, however, because forcing a culture or a group to assimilate to the mainstream also means that they are somewhat required to abandon the cultural ideals of their old country. And so these two things, multiculturalism and assimilation, tend to sometimes be in opposition to each other. All right, now let's talk a little bit about what we call cultural universals. Cultural universals are beliefs or behaviors that all societies share. And there are lots of examples of cultural universals. One example is the cultural universal of family. Not all societies have the same form of family, but all societies share the concept of family and what a family is supposed to do. Teaching appropriate beliefs and behaviors to children, teaching us what is right or wrong, our moral foundation, and so on. Cultural universals often revolve around shared experience behaviors, about getting together and having a meal with our family and friends, about the appropriate types of clothing that you wear in the house, outside of the house, at school, at work, etc. What a house is and what it should contain. Birth, death, sexual behavior, and rituals are also cultural universals. So cultural universals aren't the same in every culture, but cultures do share beliefs and behaviors about these aspects of their culture. All right, now let's take a minute to talk about language. So I used to be able to say to my classes, I'm sure you all know who Pink Floyd is. And in the last couple of years, I've had a handful of young students who have said they don't know who Pink Floyd is. If you don't know who Pink Floyd is, go find out. This is from one of their songs, Another Brick in the Wall, very famous song. So if you're not familiar with the music video from Another Brick in the Wall, I'm including it down below. It's rather disturbing, very interesting, and thought-provoking. But at any rate, you see the teacher talking about pudding. Now, what does he mean when he's talking about pudding? Now, in England, what we call pudding here is custard over there. And what they call pudding there is more of a savory bread pudding than what we call pudding over here. One of the names of one of those pudding dishes is called Spotted Dick. I know that sounds funny, but it comes from the Old English word puddick, and that probably over the years has been changed to the word pudding, and in the United States we adapted that in a different way than they use it in England. All right, likewise, take a look at the picture here. What do you see on the left? Of course, you see biscuits. We call them biscuits here in the United States anyhow. On the right-hand side, what do you see? And you're going to answer that you see cookies. Well, in England, those are biscuits. So if you ask for a biscuit in England, you're going to get a cookie. Another example, on the left-hand side, you would answer probably pancakes, maybe flapjacks. Well, in Sweden and some other parts of Northern Europe, on the right-hand side, that's a flapjack. We call it a granola bar. So again, we have to be able to understand each other and make an attempt to understand other cultures, and the way that we do that is by language, by defining things by language. So if you went to a restaurant in, say, some Scandinavian country and perhaps ordered flapjacks, you wouldn't get what was on the left, you would get what is on the right. If somebody from a Scandinavian country came here and ordered flapjacks, they would get what we call flapjacks or pancakes, the picture on the left, while they were expecting to get what we call granola bars, the picture on the right. So when we study culture, what we want to do is we want to try and keep our own personal biases out of the study of culture so that we can understand them for their own value or worth. If we try to impose our own cultural ideas, rules, norms, standards on other people, then we're exhibiting what is called ethnocentrism. This is when you might go to another country, and because you don't understand their cultural values, you might turn your nose up a little bit at what you're seeing or how you're expected to behave. Instead, we want to try to practice some cultural relativism, which means that we accept that culture for what it is, and we don't try to impose our own cultural sanctions on other groups of people. Now, as I said before, cultures do change. We may not see those changes day to day, week to week, even year to year, but sometimes cultures do change relatively rapidly, and that happens when technologies develop. One of the responses that we can have is culture shock. An emotional response when cultures change or when we experience different cultures. And this happens a lot of times to us when we go overseas and we're not sure what the customs are, in particular in those countries where the native language is not the same language that we speak. We might experience culture shock. We also may experience culture lag, and this can happen within your own culture. When technologies develop really quickly and we're not willing to adapt those cultures to our own use, we are experiencing culture lag. Great example of that is that grandparent that you have, or that great-grandparent that you have, or that teacher that you have, who isn't able to figure out how to text. Now, a couple of generations from now, we will all be native texters, meaning that we will grow up with that technology, and by then there will be a new technology that we will have to learn, and by that time when you are old, you will experience that same type of culture lag. All right, let's talk a little bit about cultural ideals also. We've talked about the idea of the ideal before. Remember, they don't exist in the real world, but they are good research tools. And the idea of the ideal comes from that German sociologist Max Weber. He said, we exist somewhere apart from this ideal, but the ideal is where we want to try to be. We can never really get to that ideal, remember. It's an abstract, it doesn't exist in reality, but we do try to reach it. And so we can make a list, for example, of the perfect cultural attributes of a particular society, and then we can go out into the world and we can make some measurements about where we really are, and we can see how far we might be away from that ideal. Now, Max Weber didn't use his concept of the ideal type when studying culture. He actually used it when studying governments and bureaucracies. But we can apply that same concept of the ideal type when we think about culture. How far away from the ideal do we really live? Now remember, we talked about language being important, and language is a symbol. And the symbol of language helps us to express our culture. It helps us to transmit and convey what we mean, why we mean it, why it's important, why things are good or bad. And we do this as an expression of who we are in our families, as individuals, as a nation. And embedded within communication are certain elements. Of course, gestures, those physical things that we do that have meanings. We've talked about those already. Another element of the communication process is values, and oftentimes we see this represented as what we call value pairs. When values start to support each other, we call them value clusters, meaning that, for example, hard work and getting ahead. Those are two values that hopefully support each other. Value conflict happens when values are at odds with each other. We can use the same exact example from value clusters. Working hard and getting ahead don't always come together. All right, so I want to talk now just a little bit about high culture and pop culture. Why are they so different? So let's look at this painting for a minute. Does anybody know who this artist is? Well, if you guessed Jackson Pollock, you're right. Did most of his work in the earlier part of the 1900s up to the 1950s, I believe, and was very prolific at what they call scatter or drop painting. He would take these huge canvases and he would take them out into his yard in the middle of the countryside. He was an alcoholic. He smoked nonstop, and he would set up this canvas out in the middle of the yard, and he would take his paint and he would just have at it. Now, to a lot of us, this might just look like some leftover paint that is on the wall of an artist's studio. The leftovers or the remnants from many, many paintings haven't been painted over or around it. But this particular piece of Jackson Pollock's sold in the tens of millions of dollars a couple of years ago. These are also the types of paintings that oftentimes, because we're not really sure what they are or whether they have value, find their way into yard sales. If you ever see a painting like this in a yard sale, look carefully at it. The hallmark of Pollock's paintings, which he didn't generally sign, you'll find dirt and gravel and tobacco embedded in the paint. If you find these kinds of things and the painting is cheap, snatch it up and find out whether or not it's a Jackson Pollock. You could be a millionaire. People who are part of the high culture see this work as extremely artistic, and they use it as a gatekeeping measure against the mainstream. They say that we could not possibly understand the value in Jackson Pollock's work, that we don't have the right mindset, so to speak, to be able to understand the significance of this type of painting. A lot of my students would just say, that's crazy. This doesn't look like anything except for a bunch of stuff scattered on a canvas. I could do it myself. All right, and perhaps you could. When we talk about pop culture, we're talking about art, for example, that exists in the mainstream segments of society. Not necessarily physical art on a canvas. It could be music, it could be poetry, it could be any of those kinds of things. But this is an example of some graffiti which is long since gone. It was on the side of a building, public art for everybody to see, and quite interesting, I would say. Now, what I want you to think about is how different this is from Pollock's work. I don't see it as significantly different necessarily. In fact, some could argue that there's more detail and more artistic value in this than this. So while those people who are part of the high culture use art in its many different shapes and sizes, music, books, theater, and paintings, to keep us out of the high class and tell us that we couldn't possibly understand it because we're not part of the high class, art in the pop culture exists in the mainstream and we all share it. Pop culture is not a technique that lends itself to gatekeeping. All right, everything you've learned about culture. Culture is probably the most important area of study for sociologists. It is invisible to the naked eye, but it influences every aspect of our daily lives. It not only affects how we see ourselves, but it also affects how we see others. It guides all of our thoughts and actions, and we really have to be careful about keeping our own biases out of the study of culture so that we can remain neutral and appreciate other cultures for their own value. All right, if you have any questions at all about this video or any information in the module, you know what to do. Find the discussion board below and post your questions. We'll talk again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.